Well, good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are in the United States or in other parts of the world today. This is Casey Gwynn, the president of the National Family Justice Center Alliance, and I want to welcome you to our monthly webinar today. We're very honored to have you join us. We're very excited about our presenter today and the focus area, which is such a critical one for the work that we all do in violence prevention and violence intervention work. With so many people who need us to understand where they are and what their journey has been, what their experience is, and to be able to respect them and to welcome them into communities that they can feel loved and cared for and get the help that they need and be able to move forward in their lives with success and healing. So we're very honored to have you join us today. You'll see on the screen we have a little bit of information there. I'm joined by Natalia Geary, who's the National Director of Technical Assistance for the Alliance. I'm having a little technical difficulty here. Hang on a second. I apologize for that. Thanks, friends. We had a glitch there in our national broadcasting platform. We think we have now solved it. So you'll see some information on there. Natalia Geary is our National Director of Technical Assistance, and she's supporting me today. This webinar is being recorded. All of you are muted during this presentation. I do want to let you know that we are going to be accepting questions both during and at the end of the presentation. If you're logged into our GoToMeeting platform, you will type in those questions, and those will come to Natalia, and she will provide them to me so that we can give them to Ursula as she presents with us today. And we will take the questions then and work through them at the end of the formal presentation today. As I said, my name is Casey Gwynn. I'm the president of the National Family Justice Center Alliance, and on behalf of our CEO, Gail Strack, and our whole team here at the Alliance, we appreciate you joining us today. This is our team at the National Family Justice Center Alliance. We always like to give a shout out to what Gail calls our small but mighty team. We enjoy the work that we do together and always appreciate the chance to be able to see you all at various seminars and workshops around the country. We always prefer in-person contact, but in the absence of that, we do a lot of national broadcasting, both by audio calls and through webinars. We do want to thank the U.S. Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women, for sponsoring this webinar today. We serve as the technical assistance provider for family justice centers and for other kinds of multi-agency models around the country that are trying to bring together professionals from both government and non-government agencies, working together to address issues around domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, elder abuse, stalking, and related forms of oppression that really connect to the family, that connect to abuse in the home. So we're very honored to have OVW support. We actually just had Bea Hansen here at the National Family Justice Center Alliance last week as part of OVW's National Listening Tour. Bea and her team are traveling all over the country. Some of you may have had forums in your communities, and we appreciated having Bea here and at about 40 agencies from San Diego County all together with her, really reflecting on where we've been since the passage of the Violence Against Women Act in 1994 and where we all hope to go in the work that we're all doing. I do want to give a couple shout-outs before we jump into the webinar. Some of you know we host the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, which is the largest and most comprehensive training program in America for professionals dealing with strangulation assaults, both in intimate partner violence and in sexual assault situations. The most dangerous men in the world strangle women in the midst of other types of assaults. And so we run that institute. Gail Strack's been leading that effort nationally as a research leader and policy leader for over 20 years. And we are hosting our next institute in Fort Worth, Texas, February 24th to 27th. We're actually hosting it at the new One Safe Place Family Justice Center, which is the largest, most comprehensive family justice center in the United States, just opened. Really quite stunning 70,000 square foot facility. And they did one of the things that we challenged them to do, which was to build a training facility within the Family Justice Center. So they have a 160-seat conference room and 6 breakout rooms. And so we're seeing teams already registering, multidisciplinary teams from all over the country to join us in February. So if you want more information about that, you can get it off of FamilyJusticeCenter.com or go directly to our Reg Online site for the Advanced Strangulation course. We'll have people from all over the country, mostly coming in multidisciplinary teams. You'll see a little more information about the course there on your screen. Sarah Wee, who's our Health Program Associate, is helping to coordinate that with Gail. We have a great faculty coming, and it'll be a very exciting 4-day course to really go very deep into these issues around dealing with strangulation assaults in the United States. So I wanted to give a shout out to that. Some of you also know that we host an annual conference every year. This next year our conference is in San Diego. We tend to move it around the country, but for the next 2 years we'll be in San Diego. We've rented an island that you can see there in the picture. It's April 21 to 23, and the resort is called Paradise Point Hotel and Spa. It's actually the first time we've ever done a conference that's not in a high-rise hotel, but we felt it only appropriate to go to Paradise Point this next year because
I think wait, when is it? April, is that?
We've got background noise here. I don't know who's speaking or how they're getting into our call, but we're hearing background noise from somebody talking. I apologize for that. The resort that we've rented is really appropriate for our theme for 2015, which is Health Matters, Hope Heals, what every professional needs to know about trauma. And we will be very focused on trauma-informed care, trauma-informed practices, trauma-informed interviewing, and really understanding how to deal with victims of trauma in a way that doesn't re-victimize them in the process of providing support and services. So we're excited about it. We're going to sell out. We're already rapidly selling out. We have capacity for about 500. So if you're interested in that, you can go to FamilyJusticeCenter.com to get more information about our conference. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. It'll be available on our website in about 48 hours. We have an online resource library at FamilyJusticeCenter.com. You just click on Resource Library and go directly to that information. The resource library used to be password protected and required membership, but we made the decision to open that up a number of months ago to not only our 11,000 members worldwide, but also to others that are interested in accessing our online resources. So this webinar will be recorded and available for download, so that if you have other groups that you would like to play it for or get together with people and listen to it, you're very much able to do that. We are a continuing education provider in the state of California for lawyers and for CEUs as well, for therapists and other providers, but we do not provide those services throughout the country. It tends to be, however, that the information that we provide for CEUs and MCLE in California are good enough to get credits in other states. So you'll receive a checklist after this webinar that will allow you to download all the information from this webinar to use if you want to seek credit in your state. So let's dive in. It's my great honor to introduce Ursula Campos-Johnson, who's going to be presenting for us today. Ursula has a master's in social work. She's the coordinator of the Hate Violence Program as part of the New York City Anti-Violence Program. She's been doing the work for 6 years in the LGBTQ community. She is a survivor of intimate partner violence. She identifies as pansexual in orientation, and she was born and raised in Brooklyn. We're very excited to have her joining us. Ursula's done a lot of work, not just in New York City, but she's also done a lot of work at the educational level with Columbia School of Social Work, with the Columbia School of Nursing, with the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. She's affiliated with the Manhattan Family Justice Center. And we just so appreciate not only the work that she does, but really the expertise that she brings to this topic. Whatever your background or training that you may or may not have had in the world of LGBT, GNC, QH, and related issues, this is a crucial topic for us. So many that don't understand and don't have respect for folks that are coming to us for help are going to fail them if we don't really understand who we're dealing with and what their beliefs and values are and where they come from, what their life experience is, how they identify themselves. And these pieces are so important. So as we dive into this, you know, I know the journey that we're on in this country and the controversies and the battles around social issues and political issues and conservative folks and liberal folks and on and on and on. But when it comes to this work, we all need to be united in an approach that says we're going to reach out with respect, we're going to get educated and reach out with understanding in order to meet the needs of people that come to us for help. So we're very honored, Ursula, to have you join us today.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn over the controls to you, and welcome to our monthly webinar. It's all yours.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Casey. So I definitely come with certain expertise, but just to put out there that I know there's just so much expertise from, you know, folks in the audience, and to acknowledge that some of the information that I'll be giving today may be new for some folks, some of it may be a review for other folks, and I'm just really appreciative of all the experts, I can't say in the room, which is what I typically do, but who are listening in and open to learning about working with the LGBTQ and or HIV-affected communities who are affected by intimate partner violence. So I'll get started. So the title of this workshop is Working with LGBTQ and or HIV-affected survivors of intimate partner violence at Family Justice Centers, and exploring what some obstacles in working with folks of those communities and some opportunities would be in Family Justice Centers. And we say and or HIV affected because often folks are kind of put together like you must be HIV affected if you're part of the LGBTQ community, and we want to be clear that although that may be what folks may assume about LGBTQ folks, that not everyone who's LGBTQ is HIV affected, and not everyone who's HIV affected is LGBTQ. So we did fix that to say and or, to be mindful of the fact that we don't want to perpetuate stigmas against the community. So as Casey introduced me, I'm Ursula Campos-Johnson. I'm coordinator of the Hate Violence Program, and that is our general office number. And also in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the number to our 24-hour bilingual hotline. And we take calls nationally, and we have a national coalition of anti-violence programs that I'll also talk about as well, so folks will be connected. So just a little information about our mission and our values. We envision a world where all LGBTQ and or HIV-affected folks are safe and live free from violence. So ideally, AVP and the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs doesn't have to exist because everybody's free from violence. But in the meantime, what we do want to do is collaborate with folks so that we won't be one of the only places in New York City that provides services to LGBTQ and or HIV-affected survivors of violence, but that anybody who provides services to survivors of domestic violence and intimate partner violence is also comfortable with and inclusive of LGBTQ and or HIV-affected communities. Our mission is to empower LGBTQ communities and allies as well, because allies are very important in this struggle, to end all forms of violence through organizing and education. And we support survivors through counseling and advocacy. And something that's not on here is we also support survivors if they're not into counseling and or advocacy, because healing and that journey to healing can look different for each person. We also support folks if they want to join our community organizing efforts as well. And we are nationally recognized as experts on best practices when working with LGBTQH survivors of violence. And on our website, which the website is on the lower left-hand corner, you can find information for our warm line, which is for service providers nationwide to call in and get technical assistance from the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs. And so here at the Anti-Violence Project, we have kind of three prongs, three ways that we provide support to folks, either folks who are learning about the LGBTQ and or HIV-affected communities, or folks who are part of those communities. And so one of the ways, which is the department that I'm from, is our Client Services Department. We have, as I mentioned, our 24-hour hotline. It's bilingual in English and Spanish. And we, in the Client Services Department, are taking hotline calls during business hours, so Monday through Friday, 10 to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then after those hours, we have volunteers that have been trained to take hotline calls that take on those hotline calls after hours. We also provide short-term individual supportive counseling around all types of violence, so not just intimate partner violence. Also domestic violence shelter advocacy. So folks can come in and do an assessment with us to see if we can provide them with domestic violence shelter through one of our partners, since we don't have our own shelter, which we'll talk a little bit about later, but it can often be a struggle for folks who are transgender or male identified to get placed in shelter for domestic violence specifically. Our support groups that we have range from hate violence support groups, sexual violence support groups, or intimate partner violence support groups. And we also provide advocacy with organizations. So if somebody is experiencing discrimination by another service provider or the police aren't being responsive, we will advocate for that person on behalf of that person. We also provide accompaniment. So often what's reported to us is somebody may not feel comfortable going to another service provider because of their previous experiences with discrimination. And so having us there as a buffer can be helpful for folks to kind of take the next steps that they would like to take in their journey to either healing or, engaging with the criminal justice system as well. And we also provide services and assistance in filing for the Office of Victim Services. And this, I think every state has one, but it's basically a state-run organization that provides monetary compensation for folks who are victims of crime and have experienced any type of crime and have experienced a loss of wages or medication or need therapy as a result of a crime. So that's something else that we do in the Client Services Department. Our Legal Services Department is fairly new. They're about a year old now, and we have one lawyer, a paralegal, and an intern. So we're still growing, but right now we're being able to provide representation specifically for survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual violence, and consultation for survivors across the spectrum of violence, as well as advocacy. And all those services, the direct services work, and also the legal services, all of those services are free as well. Through our community organizing department, we provide education and training. So although I'm in client services, today I'm doing a little bit of that community organizing and providing some education and training. And we provide education and training for service providers, for law enforcement, for folks working in the criminal justice system, as well as community members who may want to even make their own spaces more inclusive of LGBTQ and HIV-affected folks. We also have rapid incident response, which basically means if an incident happens in New York City or touches any of like our national work as well, then we would respond rapidly and provide folks with connections to community-based organizations, but also call upon politicians in the area where the violence happened to see what they are doing to address this issue, as well as talking to law enforcement and district attorneys to see if a survivor might want to talk to us, but also to see what we can kind of do to support folks in those systems. And as I mentioned before, we have a national coalition of anti-violence programs. We have about 40-plus anti-violence programs across the nation, and 2 in Canada. And those folks all use the same intake sheets as us. And so we're able to put out national report publication 2 a year, 1 for hate violence and 1 for intimate partner violence, specifically around the experiences of LGBTQ and or HIV-affected folks. And finally, we do public advocacy. So that even includes the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. We worked with a lot of different organizations to make sure that LGBTQ and or HIV-affected folks were included in that conversation, as well as some work around stop and frisk in New York City as well. We are citywide, so we're in all 5 boroughs. We're in all of the family justice centers in New York City. Staten Island does not have a family justice center just yet, but we're also going to be there. We're also at the Staten Island LGBT Community Center, and in the Bronx, we're at Boom Health, which is a preventative and also harm reduction organization, and the Adolescent AIDS Program's LGBTQ-focused umbrella project. So today we have, a few objectives. I'm excited to go through these objectives and go through the slides. I'm also especially excited to hear your questions towards the end because, again, there's a lot of expertise in the room, and this information may be a review for some folks, maybe new for some folks. I'm excited to hear questions, comments, constructive criticism and all that as well. So we want to support you in developing basic language and skills to effectively work with LGBTQ and or HIV-affected individuals, and to understand the unique experiences of LGBTQ and or HIV-affected individuals who have experienced intimate partner violence. And as mentioned in the title, kind of figuring out what are some roadblocks to accessing mainstream safety services and also support for LGBTQ survivors of violence, and ways that as a service provider in whichever position you're in, how you can support someone in overcoming barriers to service by either creating change individually or systemically, and creating those welcoming and inclusive environments and family justice centers where folks can feel that they will be able to go to an organization to file a report and get services. So we're going to do a bit of a review in terms of language and terminology. And I know that there might be some questions about language and terminology. We are going to get into probably some of the answers as we go forward. So the standard acronym, LGBTQ, as I mentioned before, stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and or HIV affected. So some of the information here, such as the Q, so some information that's not on here is that the Q can also stand for questioning as well. And I think something to think about, since we're not able to have like an open conversation over the phone, is to think about what are some ideas, assumptions that you might have about folks who identify as lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgender. And that's one of the most important steps in providing services to folks that may be not part of a community that you identify with, or maybe part of a community that you identify with, but we may all have still had some information from society about what those communities represent. An example of that is bisexual. that category often when I ask folks, you know, what are your assumptions about folks who identify as bisexual? There's often some assumptions about folks being greedy or not being able to make up your mind or being confused or it's just a phase when in fact that may be somebody's identity, you know, for quite a long time, for their whole life. And so not confusing that term with questioning. And questioning is when somebody identifies like I'm not sure about my sexual orientation. That would be more, that would be where questioning can fit in a little more. Also, something that tends to come up in trainings in terms of a question about terminology is asking about the term queer. I know for myself, queer was something used as a negative and was not necessarily a term that you would want to be called. And one of the ways to explain why this term is being used again is kind of a reclaiming of a word that basically talks about how, okay, queer was used before to say I'm weird, to say I'm not normal, and folks kind of being proud about being part of a community that is different. And so using queer as a term to identify as such as well. And I know that when Casey introduced me, he let folks know about my sexual orientation, which is that I identify as pansexual. And you don't see that on LGBTQ or H in the acronym. So one thing to keep in mind is that although maybe when I said pansexual, maybe not, folks may have wondered, you know, what does that mean? That question, I think, is a valid question, and then making sure when you're meeting with someone to make it seem less biased, so finding out, like, you know, what their identity is if they say pansexual, you know, writing that down, and then doing research about the term so folks aren't necessarily educating you as a service provider. But pansexual, basically, to explain, means that I'm attracted to folks across the gender identity spectrum. So rather than thinking in terms of bisexual, that there's only man and women, but that there's a spectrum of gender identities. And I think pansexual, some folks read it as I'm attracted to everyone, but I also have standards, and folks who are pansexual and or bisexual often are lumped and said, like, you know, that means you're attracted to everyone, and that's not necessarily true, just as heterosexual folks, not everyone is attracted to everyone of the opposite sex, but rather we have, you know, some folks that we're attracted to and some that we're not. So with that said, something to remember is, let me try and use this highlighter, that these terms are fluid and don't represent all sexual orientations or gender identities. And so when you ask an open-ended question such as, what is your sexual orientation, that allows somebody to fill that in, which is very important, and it's always best and important to respect folks' self-determination and honor the terms they use to identify themselves, even if those are new terms to us or maybe terms that we may have thought of as an insult before, such as queer.
Appreciate it.
So we're going to talk a little bit about gender as well, since we talked a little bit about sexual orientation. And, you know, asking ourselves as folks who provide services to survivors of intimate partner violence in whatever capacity that is, why is it important to think about gender in the context of intimate partner violence? And one of the biggest things that comes up is often, even for myself, before I started my work here at the Anti-Violence Project, I grew up thinking, okay, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, woman as victim, and man as abuser. And so thinking about who we perceive as violent according to their gender identity or the way that they look, their presentation, and thinking about who can be more victimized for those same reasons and where those kind of ideas that we've developed have come from. So it's important to think about gender because of that as well, since there are limited ideas about sex and gender. And often, high levels of violence and discrimination happen to LGBTQ folks who don't follow traditional gender roles. And not just LGBTQ folks. The example that I use pretty often is if somebody, even if they identify as heterosexual, and let's say they identify as a heterosexual man, and they decide to go into nursing, that even still today, that doesn't fit into what people may think is an appropriate gender role for a man. And so folks may use homophobic language, right, or sexist language in order to tease that person and bully that person and make them feel bad. So it happens very often that when we don't fit into certain gender roles, that there's a backlash in the heterosexual community, but also in the LGBTQ community. And one of the things that we kind of come into contact pretty often before, not as often now, but still when folks are interacting with law enforcement and there are two people of the same gender identity and one person is more masculine looking, folks have tended to assume that the person who's more masculine looking is the abuser because, again, going back to like what have we kind of learned about or known about domestic violence for a very long time. So we have some traditional ideas about sex here and how we kind of define sex, which is often biological and physiological characteristics. That's how folks often think about sex. And the things that typically make up our sex are primary sex characteristics such as genitalia and also like the inner workings as well, our reproductive systems, chromosomes, which are not as visible, are not visible, as well as hormones. And often, and again, something to think about, right? Often we can rely on secondary sex characteristics to help us figure out how somebody identifies, if they identify as a man or a woman. Those can be facial hair, height, body mass, vocal range as well. And it could even be, and I don't think this is a secondary sex characteristic, but, you know, how somebody like, you know, is their hair cut a certain way, right? Like how somebody walks and like you see them from behind and you might make assumptions about somebody's gender identity. And I think part of the work for today is not to ask that like those assumptions, or not to say that those assumptions will never happen, but that although they're happening, that we make sure as service providers to be able to know, okay, this is happening to me and I am making assumptions about somebody's identity, but I'm still going to ask them an open-ended question, how do you identify, rather than going with our assumptions. And gender, as we spoke about a little, or as I spoke about a little bit, refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, et cetera, that society considers appropriate for men and women. And I used the example before of the male nurse, but then there are also examples about, you know, folks who identify as women, and this is very man-woman focused, you know, the examples that I'm giving, but folks who identify as women and maybe, you know, would like to be a mechanic or maybe like even being a doctor. Like those are things that society typically may bunch in with folks who are male identified, especially if folks are in positions of power and identify as women or more feminine presenting. And masculine and feminine are gender categories. So male and female are sex categories, and masculine and feminine are gender categories. So I spoke a little bit about gender identity. And one of the important takeaways of this is that how somebody identifies may not always equal how that person looks or presents. But we may identify someone because of going back to secondary sex characteristics, you know, what our assumptions are about, you know, somebody who identifies as a man or identifies as a woman. But the most important thing is gender identity does not have to equal how somebody looks on the outside. It's unique to every individual, and it may not always match the sex that they were assigned at birth. And the term that's often used when assigned sex does not match a person's gender identity is transgender. And if you notice, I use assigned sex rather than born as, you know, or their real sex, etc. And I use assigned sex because when we're babies, we can't really choose which sex and or gender we identify as. You know, the same thing for our name. We can't really choose our name. We're assigned a name at birth. I wouldn't have chosen Ursula if I had a choice in it. So just to break down what we went over in terms of gender, gender role is more the role that we take on according to societal expectations, such as type of jobs and the way that we express ourselves. So that could be how we sit, how we make gestures, how we talk. Gender expression is how we choose to communicate our identity. And that could be the way that we dress, our hairstyle, shaving, not shaving, you know, doing your eyebrows or not doing your eyebrows. And people read into that because of the way that we talk about, you know, men and women and having to fit into certain boxes. And gender identity are our innermost feelings regarding who we are in terms of gender, such as woman or man. And for some folks, their gender identity may not be so binary, so it may not be just two. May not be man or woman, but a person may identify as gender neutral. A person, you know, may use you know, they or them as a gender neutral pronoun to refer to themselves as well, because they may not identify as being a man or a woman. And again, you know, acknowledging that depending on where we're coming from and how much information we have and which communities we're from, this information might be new and confusing. The most important thing is that being confused can be normal, and having biases is normal, that happens, but that we don't project that onto the person that we're working with, and then we continue asking open-ended questions about identity and respecting their, you know, the way that they self-identify. So I'm going to read a little quote about gender socialization, actually a big quote. "It's beautiful," I exclaim. "It is, in fact, a particularly fine watch my father has just bought for my 7th birthday. The jeweled face throwing back at me the summer sunlight. It's searching for the right word. It's divine." I breathe happily. My father's face comes up sharply, his pupils narrowing. Boys don't say divine. And he watches me, his head cocked slightly to one side. I open my mouth to question this unfathomable statement, but there is something hard in his voice and his eyes. Suddenly my pleasure evaporates and is replaced entirely by fear. I know if I question him, I'll probably get the palm of his hand. So that really speaks to how folks who are part of the LGBTQ community, but also folks who may not be part of the LGBTQ community, how certain reactions when we're growing up from either parents or, you know, classmates and such will make us feel like we cannot be out about certain things, whether that's using the word divine, whether that's, you know, our actual identity. And so it can be really hard and sometimes misread when folks are not as open about certain, you know, certain information because they're afraid of a reaction because of their previous experiences of discrimination. And another thing to emphasize is that sexual orientation and gender identity are different. So sexual orientation, it's about who you are attracted to romantically, sexually, or spiritually. And gender identity is, again, how you understand your own gender and how you express that. And sometimes people may put together, you know, if somebody identifies as a woman, and not that any of you here do that, but if you have, if somebody identifies as a woman, then she must be attracted to men. Right? And that is heteronormative thought process because it's saying you must be heterosexual rather than, you know, asking an open-ended question about somebody's sexual orientation. So transgender, as we spoke about very briefly, is an umbrella term and is used to describe folks whose way of understanding and expressing their own gender is different from what society expects. Many people don't embrace this term. I think of the many trainings I've gone to, and folks are not accepting of the term transgender in hostile ways, not ways of learning. And something to think about in terms of transgender is if folks have worked with Spanish-speaking clients, sometimes folks use the term transsexual and may not use transgénero. So transsexual would translate to transsexual, and transgénero would translate to transgender. So while I may shy away from using transsexual in English, if somebody identifies themselves to me as such, then I will, use that information and put that down in the intake form as well. Some folks who fit under the umbrella term of transgender are folks whose gender identity is fluid. So the folks may use different pronouns, so pronouns being she or he or they, use different pronouns at certain times in their lives and change their name or change the way that they dress. And I think something that can happen, and has happened even to myself, is kind of this rigidity of if somebody identifies as she, then that person must continue to identify as such, and that cannot shift. And something new to kind of embrace, or that's not new but being spoken of, I think, more often, is that folks may be more fluid in terms of their gender identity. And again, that may be confusing, and that may, bring up biases. And the important part is if somebody says, well, I identify as she today, and then another time they identify and use a gender-neutral pronoun such as they, that you mirror that language. And that's one of the most important things of the work in general in terms of providing services to survivors of intimate partner violence. So in the trans community, folks may use the term transitioning to talk about moving into the life of one's authentic gender identity. And some folks may wonder if somebody is transitioning, have they received sex reassignment surgery, or are they taking hormones? And something to keep in mind is that not everyone wants to have sex reassignment surgery or take hormones, and not everyone can afford to do that, and it may not be safe for some folks to use medical procedures to move into their authentic gender identity as well. And that every person's transitioning process is unique to that individual, and that if, thinking about what are the questions that you may ask somebody who identifies as trans that you wouldn't ask to somebody who is not part of the trans community. And if you would ask a person who identifies as trans about hormones and sex reassignment surgery, and it's not relevant to the work that you're doing, that might be sightseeing and may not be information that you need at that time. So again, some steps taken by folks who identify as trans or gender nonconforming can include hormone therapy. Some folks may change their name, changing their pronoun that they use, their expression, and also sex or gender reassignment surgery, which can also be called gender affirming surgery. Gender nonconforming is also an umbrella term, which is used to describe folks whose way of expressing their gender is different from what society expects. So I identify as a woman, a cisgender woman, and I don't know if folks know that term, but cisgender is basically someone who is assigned a certain gender at birth and continues identifying with that gender as they go on in life. So in terms of folks who are, cisgender, they may not be part of the trans or gender nonconforming community, but folks who are cisgender may be gender nonconforming. So they may dress outside of their gender identity according to what society expects, and so their presentation could be gender nonconforming. And terms The terms transgender and gender nonconforming are often combined as TG and C, but not everybody who identifies as gender nonconforming identifies as trans, and vice versa as well. And so again, it's important to respect somebody's self-determination as well. So there are different levels of discrimination that happen in LGBTQ communities. The different types that can come up are homophobia, transphobia, and heterosexism. And the different levels are interpersonal, institutional, and internalized. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So some examples that can come up for folks in terms of interpersonal discrimination is the use of anti-LGBTQ slurs or harassment, family rejection, outing someone as well. And what you'll see when we also talk about intimate partner violence is that often these examples of discrimination that happen on interpersonal, institutional, and internalized levels are mirrored in intimate partner violence. So it's basically like the same thing happening, but in that in the relationship. Institutionally, in terms of systemic discrimination, there's still unequal access to employment for trans folks, and trans folks can still be fired in New York State just for being transgender. Not in New York City, but still in New York State. Often what happens is also trans women are seen as sex workers and profiled by the police even though they may not be doing sex work. And they can also be profiled not just by the police but by communities such as the LGBT community. And as I mentioned before, gay and bisexual men and also trans folks have limited or no access to domestic violence shelters. Even though VAWA was reauthorized, folks are still having a hard time because, again, of the historic understanding of domestic violence of being inclusive of folks who are male-identified and or trans-identified. Furthermore, there's often re-victimization by service providers, so somebody feeling like they have to educate a service provider on being inclusive about their communities, not knowing if services are open to LGBTQ folks. So something that we'll talk about a little bit towards the end is thinking about, what does your brochure look like? What do the posters in your in your area that you're working in look like? Are they all folks who are survivors of domestic violence and all seem to be identifying as women, and what that means for folks who may not fall within that category, and folks may not think that they qualify for services. Also, if somebody sees an intake form and they maybe have only two options, male or female, maybe that person wants to let folks know that they identify as a trans woman, and there's no option for them, then that person has to fill out other, and how that can feel discriminatory again, and it is on an institutional level. Fear of coming out. So every single time somebody, gets in touch with a service provider and it's around intimate partner violence and their sexual orientation, they have to come out. So they have to come out to that service provider, and folks are concerned about, what will the reaction be of that service provider, and will that service provider out me to other people as well. And this is because, not that this is something that you all do, but that this is because they've had previous experiences, whether that's interpersonal experiences or institutional experiences where they may have been outed before. And that could be about their sexual orientation, gender identity, or HIV status. Experiencing ridicule, mistreatment, and violence by service providers. So folks being told, like, it's not domestic violence if folks identify as two men in a relationship, or it's just a cat fight if folks identify, as two women, or if somebody identifies as a trans woman and is with a person who identifies as a man, being told, what their sexual orientation is, or being told like you were born a man and so you have to deal with it as a man. So all these things can happen with service providers, and that's across the board, social workers, law enforcement, lawyers, etc., that folks report to us as having experienced. And folks are also afraid if they do come out, they will lose services or receive substandard care. Folks They're afraid that folks may not call them. They're afraid that, a person may not advocate either. So some further examples of discrimination: unequal access to safe restroom facilities. Folks who identify as trans or gender nonconforming often have to plan for their safety when going into restroom facilities. In New York, we have Local Law 3, where folks are protected to use whichever bathroom they identify with, but that's not the same in every state. And so folks have to plan for their safety because often people react, even though there are stalls, people react to having someone that they may not be able to read in terms of gender identity. If somebody's identification doesn't match how they prefer to be identified, folks may have a hard time going to family justice centers, interacting with the criminal justice system, legal system, because that may require identification. And folks are concerned, understandably, from my experience in terms of the clients that have come in, folks, their preferred name is often not respected, and the name on the identification is often the name that keeps coming out. So even in that, right, that can happen as a mistake, and making sure that if you make a mistake in terms of not using somebody's preferred name, that you maybe write it down somewhere on a file, on a Post-it, so that you can remember and be more mindful. There are definitely higher rates of misarrest because folks may be experiencing discrimination when they're more masculine presenting as well as trying to access orders of protection. That can be harder too for folks who are more masculine presenting and who are part of the LGBTQ community. So some helpful tips in terms of asking questions about identity. I keep saying open-ended questions, and that is really the way to go. So I like to make sure that I have all the information correct on the intake. I have your name as blank. Is this the name that you would like me to use? So this is not an open-ended question, but the last part is. Is this the name that you would like me to use? The person can say that that's okay, or that you can use a different name as well. And it's respectful, to ask somebody, if they, however they identify, that you want to make sure that you're using their preferred pronoun and their preferred name. And I bring this back to intimate partner violence to say that by asking open-ended questions, you're giving people choices, and often we see that the dynamics of domestic violence and intimate partner violence are taking people's choices away. And as service providers, it's really important that you give folks a space where they can feel that they have choices and they feel that they're respected and they're not being minimized and such, which, are dynamics, as you all know, that happen in domestic violence. So bringing it back to that, this can be really great in terms of, a corrective emotional experience for folks in terms of having choices and not minimizing their experience. Asking someone, is there a different name you'd prefer I use? In terms of gender identity and sexual orientation, do you mind sharing with me how you identify? And a person might say, like, what are you talking about? Because although I use gender identity and sexual orientation as terms, not everyone who's part of the LGBTQ and or HIV-affected communities may use these terms when talking about their gender identity or sexual orientation. So you could say how you identify your gender identity or your sexual orientation or who you're attracted to. And do you mind sharing with me how you identify your sexual orientation? So some more guidelines for respectful conversation: using pronouns that are consistent with a person's stated preference. If you don't know their preference, ask. So one of the ways to ask is, what's your preferred gender pronoun? What gender pronoun do you prefer me to use when I'm talking about you to my supervisor or I'm advocating for you? What is your preference? And if you don't know their preference and you haven't had an opportunity to ask them, the safest way to go is to use somebody's name. So don't, and this is something that I mentioned before, try not to go sightseeing into a person's life by asking questions regarding their transition if it is not relevant to your work. If you are a medical professional and this person needs medication and you're trying to figure out for their safety what they kind of need, that's different. But if it's not relevant to the situation, then please make sure to not ask questions regarding somebody's transition. So in January 2013, the CDC found that LG and B folks experience IPV and SV at the same or higher rates as heterosexual folks. 44% of lesbians and 26% of gay men have been the victim of rape, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. So with that information, a question to ask yourself is, what did I think? Like, how often did I think that intimate partner violence happens in the LGBTQ communities? And what are the reasons that I thought that number as well? In 2013, we documented through our report, Intimate Partner Violence Report, that there were 21 intimate partner violence homicides in 2013, the highest recorded level for 2 years in a row. So last year, there were also 21 intimate partner violence homicides. And there were 19 in 2011, and more than 3 times the 6 documented homicides in 2010, so the highest ever documented. And not everybody reports to the Anti-Violence Project, nor does every person who is at a crime scene. They may not be able to discern that somebody was an intimate partner violence situation, by how they identify or assumptions or what the abuser is telling the police as well. LGBTQ youth, young adults, people of color, gay men, bi survivors, and transgender women were the most impacted by intimate partner violence in 2013. Transgender survivors were more likely to face physical violence and discrimination due to intimate partner violence and more likely to experience intimate partner violence in public spaces. So too often, the abusive partner of someone who identifies as trans uses discrimination perpetuated by society to isolate that person, to make that person feel less than. And the majority of survivors of IPV, 36.8%, reported to NCAVP in 2013 were between the ages of 19 and 29. And the majority of those reporting are gay-identified survivors. In 2013, 42.8% of total survivors identified as gay, very similar to 2012. So some different examples of power and control tactics. Again, the interpersonal is very similar to discrimination. Use of homophobic or transphobic, biphobic slurs, throwing away hormones if somebody is transitioning and using hormones, controlling a partner's gender expression. And this doesn't just happen, right, in LGBTQ relationships. Often folks control their partner's way of dress in heterosexual relationships. Negating personal decisions about medical care, clothes, makeup, etc., telling the partner they deserve the abuse. For folks who identify as trans and or for folks who have experienced sexual violence and may not be comfortable with certain body parts being touched or referred to, and the partner knows this, the partner may exploit this to maintain control in the relationship. Some uses of institutions by the abuser is calling the police first, filing false child abuse charges, co-opting limited services available to LGBTQ folks, and threatening to out the partner. And that could be around gender identity, sexual orientation, or HIV status, as well as threatening to jeopardize immigration status. And violence affects everyone. And I think that goes without saying with all the expertise in the room as well. So in terms of intimate partner violence, and I want to be mindful of time as well, in terms of intimate partner violence, putting survivors at risk of contracting HIV, when somebody feels like they don't have the decision-making abilities in a relationship or that their decisions are minimized or their concerns are minimized, often someone is unable to negotiate the use of safer sex practice with abusive partners. And some abusers might intentionally attempt to infect their partners, not just with HIV, but also with additional STIs to keep the victim from leaving. So some different ways that HIV status is used as a mean of power and control are threats to reveal HIV status to folks who are not privy to someone's HIV status, using somebody's HIV status as an excuse for their violence, saying that this is their fault, that they are not worthy, etc. threatening to use the survivor's HIV status as grounds for custody, although this is not ideal, or not ideal, but often it doesn't happen that somebody's HIV status will interfere with having custody, but a person can be scared enough to not try and fight for custody. Threatening to assist someone when they're sick, and folks who are HIV positive who require care giving might be successful at manipulating survivors or victims into accessing care. So there are different reasons why folks stay. I think that all of these reasons are probably reasons that you may have heard in terms of financial resources, medical care, and support systems. I think depending on where you live, moving, if somebody's a live-in partner, moving might not be an option. If a person shares a child with their partner, leaving that child behind or, finding a place for them together may not be an option, especially if domestic violence shelters are not being inclusive of LGBTQ folks who are masculine identified or trans identified as well. LGBTQ folks have higher rates of poverty than non-LGBTQ people, and TGNC folks have rates at about double the national average of poverty. And TGNC people of color, particularly if they identify as Black or African American or Latino, have nearly 4 times the national rates of poverty. So keeping that in mind in terms of why it might be even harder for somebody who identifies as LGBTQ and as a person of color to leave a relationship. For someone who is HIV affected, leaving can raise an array of concerns about caregiving if they're the caregiver or the person receiving, and also the stigma of having HIV or AIDS. LGBTQH folks may have less of a support network of family and friends. What we see is the statistics in terms of family abandonment of young folks is that 40% of the homeless youth population are LGBTQ and have been kicked out of their home after they've come out. And so if they develop a relationship with somebody and that person is the only person they have, it may seem and feel and be that they have nobody else to reach out to, right? They also might fear their identity. It might be more likely to be disclosed if they reached out for safety-related assistance, and that partner notification practices for folks who are HIV positive may put them at risk of further violence. So some unique considerations for folks who are LGBTQ and are HIV affected when you're safety planning with them is to respect preferences around identity. I've said this a lot, but it's very important because you are creating that safe space for them, and that can be a really positive experience for someone's identity to be respected if their identity is being used in the relationship against them. Respecting confidentiality, consider social location and context, race, class, religion, education, ability, etc., and how that might affect how systems interact with that person and how that person feels about certain systems as well. And that could be, the social worker system, that could be the law enforcement system, criminal justice system, hospital, etc. So thinking about that, that relationship. Discussing potential benefits and risks of disclosures and interactions with police, medical system, criminal justice system, and service providers. So often, what we do here is that we provide folks with the risks and benefits and different options and outcomes. So that person can make their choices. And again, one of the big things that I see in my work here is increasing somebody's choices when they've felt that they didn't have any left. So you could be a place where you can provide choices to somebody. Because the community is very small, depending on where you are, but even in New York City, we have to plan for folks routinely running into their abusive partners at the LGBT center, at groups, etc., and what they can do, whether that is, provide an order of protection to a person at the front desk if they feel comfortable, or deciding to leave if they see, their abusive partner in a group, etc. So that is something to take into consideration for folks who are LGBTQ and may have a very small community depending on where you're located. And one of the important things this should definitely be at the top, in my opinion, is including resilience and strengths. What has worked for that person in the past? What are the tools they have used to cope or survive already? They have survived and they've gotten to you, and that takes a lot. And so they have tools. They may not call it safety planning. They may not call it, however we call it as service providers, but they have expertise as well. And I'm sure you all consider that too, and also considering that they know their partner best and their partner's schedule, their partner's reactions to things, their partner's triggers as well. So it's really important to include that in safety planning, not just for LGBTQ folks, but for all the folks that we work with. So some action steps when responding to LGBTQ survivors. So making your FJC welcoming and safe for LGBTQ and or HIV-affected survivors of intimate partner violence are on different levels. So there are definitely individual and definitely institutional action steps. So the first thing that I know I said probably at the beginning is to assess your own values or beliefs regarding sexual orientation and gender identity. So going back, reviewing this training and asking yourself, what do I think about these communities? And maybe, where have I gotten, what was the first time that I got information about LGBTQ folks, about HIV-affected folks as well, and how that might inform one's opinions now, values, or beliefs now. In line with that, addressing your internal biases. If you know that you have a certain thing that you think about bisexual folks, or if you think that, and this is something that, folks have thought that pansexual is not a valid identity or whatever, addressing, why you might think that, and if you continue thinking that, making sure to not take it out on the client, and making sure that you treat folks who identify as LGBTQ and are HIV affected the same way that you would treat a person who identifies as heterosexual and identifies as a woman. Educating yourself is very important. So if I was a survivor of violence and I let you know my sexual orientation is pansexual, rather than asking me, oh, what's that, and, oh, that's so interesting, keeping that in mind, that you have those questions, and being able to call the anti-violence program or Google information about folks who identify as pansexual so you don't make someone feel like they're being tokenized or objectified. Some additional interpersonal action steps is using inclusive language such as partner. And I'm sure you've heard me use that over and over again today, because that it's not an open-ended question, but it is open in terms of partner does not indicate that somebody, like what somebody's gender identity is as somebody's partner. Also, I keep saying that if somebody who identifies as LGBTQ comes in, then do this, do that, and do this. However, we don't know who identifies as LGBTQ, right? Not everyone may read me as part of the LGBTQ community, and so it's important to not assume anyone's sexual orientation or gender identity. There was an example that one of our counselor advocates had experience where their client who identifies as a woman was being abused by her partner who also identifies as a woman. So two women, and one had to go to the hospital because of injuries from this abusive partner. And they both went to the hospital, and then the person who was interviewing them about intimate partner violence to check in did not know or assumed that the person with them, the person who also identified as a woman, was just a friend. And that could have endangered that person's life because they had to talk about intimate partner violence in front of the abusive partner. So it's important to not assume anyone's sexual orientation or gender identity, and to ask. So to ask everyone information. Respect people's gender identity and gender expression. Be cautious of stereotypes that you may have developed. And if you make a mistake, which we all do, try not to over-apologize, because then folks will end up taking care of you as well. So you can apologize. I think one of the biggest things is apologizing, acknowledging, and not minimizing, and then creating a change in your behavior or in your words. Some institutional action steps are to create inclusive intake forms and safety plans. So we don't want to assume that anybody, we don't want to assume anybody's sexual orientation or gender identity. And the best way to do that and not assume is to have in the intake form questions that ask about sexual orientation and gender identity so that everybody is asked these questions. Create all-gender, non-segregated restrooms. So here at the Anti-Violence Project, all of our bathrooms are all-gender, and they're all stalls. So it's not like folks can see each other in the stalls, and it helps folks feel, especially folks who are gender non-conforming and or trans identified, that they have a safe space that they can go to use the restroom, which doesn't sound like a big deal if we've never had to kind of deal with safety planning in accessing bathrooms, but is a pretty big deal for folks who identify as trans or gender non-conforming. As I mentioned before, making sure to post safe space symbols in spaces. So assessing, what do our posters look like, our brochures, do we have like the transgender pride flag up somewhere or the LGBTQ pride flag somewhere as well. So posting safe space symbols in spaces that you feel are safe. So if you don't feel those spaces safe, you don't have to post it in the lobby. But if you feel like your office is a safe space, that might be a place to post these safe space symbols. Training folks. We do a lot of training nationally as well, as you can tell today. And so, getting folks trained, including folks, who are civilians if you're in law enforcement, and also folks who are at the front desk, folks who do security in the family justice centers and such on LGBTQ inclusivity. Recruit organizational partners, preferably AVPs, who provide culturally specific and inclusive services designed for unique needs of LGBTQH survivors, and have a list of LGBTQ resources available. And you can also use the warm line, again, which you can find at the website, which is on the lower left-hand corner of the PowerPoint. You can find our Technical Assistance Center there. And here it is, the number to the warm line as well. So it's 1-855-287-5428. And those are the hours Eastern Standard Time. You could also access instant messaging if you're deaf or hard of hearing, and you could also email us. Furthermore, you can definitely reach out to me. Although I'm the coordinator of the hate violence program now, for about 5 years, I specifically worked with survivors of intimate partner violence in the LGBTQ and or HIV-affected communities as the intimate partner violence counselor advocate. Darlene is also an amazing resource. She's our deputy director of client services and the coordinator of our intimate partner violence and sexual violence programs, has been doing this work for over a decade. And Shugrue Santos, who's the director of our Department of Client Services, has been doing work around survivors of intimate partner violence across the spectrum of sexual orientation and gender identities for over 2 decades. So there are a lot of resources there, and you can definitely reach out to us at any time. Thank you so much. I'm really excited for questions. I went over a little bit, but I'm going to try and address your questions as best as possible.
Well, thank you, Ursula, so much. That was great. I really appreciate you investing the time, and I know some other folks on your team were hoping to join you today.
Yeah.
So, and weren't able to, but you did great, and you gave us a lot of things to think about. We have a variety of questions, so I'll just kind of jump into them here. There's a number of questions just about this general idea of kind of where you think family justice centers should start from an outreach standpoint, given the significance of intimate partner violence in the LGBT community, kind of ideas you have for community outreach, engagement, really beginning to build that relationship with other organizations in the community that need to connect to the Family Justice Center. Obviously, you've talked a little bit about things that can be done in the center and signage and intake and other things that can be less discriminatory and more welcoming and less judgmental and more inclusive. But I don't know if you want to think a little bit more out loud about this whole notion of outreach.
Definitely.
Community engagement.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the first step before engaging with community and doing outreach is to shift internal things such as intake forms, because if you do outreach and then somebody comes into your organization and the forms are not inclusive, then that person may not believe that you're inclusive and then may do their own outreach and tell the rest of the community that you're not inclusive. So that's definitely just something to keep in mind. I think once folks have done that and have shifted things a bit internally, in terms of outreach and engagement, reaching out to local LGBTQ organizations and going to those organizations and presenting about what the Family Justice Center does has been a very useful strategy for Family Justice Centers here. And also going to different venues or events that are LGBTQ specific and or specific to folks who are HIV affected as well. Going to those events and whether that's like shifting the brochure specifically to those events to be more inclusive already, so that folks can see that they are visible and included in the analysis of intimate partner violence. So I think it's going to different organizations, talking to folks there, as well as going to different, social events, whether that's pride events, whether that's, Trans Day of Remembrance, going to those spaces and letting folks know about the organization and what it can do. Yeah. So, but I do think that first the shift has to be internal. If not, people are going to come in and, not trust that folks are able to provide support.
Well, and I will just follow up on a couple things you said, which I totally agree with. But there's a number of questions that connect to my comment, too, that I'd love you to comment on. People are asking about this whole question of how you really have people that represent the community in your Family Justice Center. That's true in a whole varieties of ways around ethnic identity, certainly around sexual orientation and gender identity. And I will just tell you that, in the first Family Justice Center in America in San Diego, when I was the attorney, it wasn't until I had gay and lesbian identified staff in the center that we had folks coming in same-sex relationships who felt safe to come there. It wasn't until we actually had those folks as part of the agency, as part of our partnerships, that we wasn't just, hey, come on in, we welcome you.
Right.
We who are predominantly heterosexual and hetero in almost all of our orientations and our forms and everything else, we really needed gay and lesbian identified staff. And when that was 2002, when that journey started, and I will say that when that changed, and it has fluctuated even in San Diego over the years, when those staff are not there and part of the leadership team and not very visible to clients, we have less representation from the LGBT community coming into the center. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. A number of people had asked about that and your view about having staff identified in the center and the intake process, advocacy. And
I think, like you said, that's very important to have staff at the center, volunteers at the center, interns at the center, right, depending on what your capacity is to have those folks, to have folks that identify with the communities that you provide services to or that you would like to provide services to as well. So I think that is definitely very important. I think something that's come up here at the Anti-Violence Project, for example, is that folks in the trans community up until like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, didn't really believe that the Anti-Violence Project was inclusive of trans folks, because at the time we may have had one person on staff that identified as trans, and until we increased the capacity of, increasing jobs, but also increasing the amount of folks who identified as trans to work here, now the trans community has developed definitely more trust with us, but that's just one example of how that can, shift things. I also think being mindful of, you want to hire folks that identify as LGBTQ and or HIV affected in order to create connections, but making sure to not tokenize those folks that are hired. And by that I mean, like, if you're hiring somebody just because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, that, what you want to make sure that they have the information and expertise to provide certain services. And that goes for, folks who identify as heterosexual as well, but making sure you don't tokenize folks and that they have the capacity to provide the support that you're looking for. But I do think it is important for the community to be mirrored in service provision.
Yeah. There's a number of questions around really the whole reality of rural communities in America and small-town communities and the homophobic reactions that exist virtually everywhere and the biases against the LGBT community in large numbers, in particularly, I would say, more so in rural and suburban communities. I mean, I spend a lot of time at family justice centers in the South where they don't even really want to have this conversation inside their community. And so there's a number of questions about that. How do you identify resources in small towns or in rural communities for LGBT needs? How do you engage the community in that conversation when you have such profound biases against the community that you're trying to address that are coming from the court system, from folks in the court system, from law enforcement folks, from others? How do you kind of try to begin that journey in communities where you're up against that? And I know that we could do a 4-hour webinar.
I know,
maybe a 5-year webinar on social change, but I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
I can definitely address it a little bit. I think that Chai Jindasurat, who does our co-coordinates or is the co-director of our community organizing department and one of the directors of the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, definitely would have even more expertise than I do on this. But I know that even for us, it has been a struggle. Even in all the national programs that we have, specifically when talking about the South and more rural communities that are not just in the South, like it can be very hard to engage folks, and we have a small amount of folks in those areas that are working with AVP because of the intense homophobia, transphobia, racism, and beyond that can exist in those spaces. And I think one of the ways that I would, recommend folks to do is to, definitely look at the list of service providers that we work with on the national level as a resource, especially the ones in the South. And also that there are organizations doing work around racial justice, justice around immigration status and such as Southerners on New Ground, SONG, that also do really great work with the LGBTQ community. So what we typically have seen is that in those spaces where folks are doing social justice work in general, in the South and in more rural communities, that those folks are able to engage in a conversation about the intersection of identities, that racial justice is also linked to LGBTQ work because people who identify as LGBTQ may also identify as people of color. So I think that's a way to find folks that are safe as well. But I do think, to just acknowledge that it is a struggle, even for us, to engage folks in rural communities to support survivors of intimate partner violence who are LGBTQ. But I do think that Chai Jindasurat would be a great person to also ask the question to, and he's actually the person on our warm line, so the number that I gave, and he has helped, he often helps people kind of figure out how to develop those spaces as well in rural communities.
And I will say to folks listening, for those of you that do have questions like that, we're happy to, if you provide us with contact information, we're happy to forward those on to Ursula and the team to be able to respond to those questions as a technical assistance provider. And I will say, Ursula, just to echo something you said, this is all about relationships. And whether it's a rural community or a suburban or urban community, if you're sensitive to these issues and you care and you want to change things, you got to find allies. And that may mean one volunteer. It may mean an organization in the community that you can bring in as an on-site partner to the Family Justice Center, or an off-site partner that comes on an on-call basis, or wherever you have to start. But it's really all about relationships, and you can't change the whole world in your community. You can at least change the way someone feels when they come into your Family Justice Center, because if they identify in a particular way, you're going to not only acknowledge it and respect it, but then try to find somebody that they feel comfortable working with and talking to and engaging with, and that's on us. I mean, that's on the leadership of Family Justice Centers. That's on people and agencies and Family Justice Centers that care about these issues. There's a number of other questions that have popped up.
Yeah.
One is around the name Family Justice Centers, and obviously, we have about 90 centers around the country, and they're not all called Family Justice Centers. I mean, some have the name One Safe Place. In Milwaukee, it's called the Family Peace Center. In Arizona, they're called Family Advocacy Centers. The names tend to vary around the country, but there are a number of comments or questions about if you have any experience in how the LGBT community views the name Family Justice Center, if that's a barrier to services or a barrier to coming, or if you know of any focus groups that have been done in the LGBT community around the naming of a multi-agency collaborative that they can reach out to that may serve a whole community rather than just serve the LGBT community.
Yeah, so I have not been privy to any focus groups around the naming of different organizations. And from my understanding from the work that I've done, folks are willing to go to the Family Justice Center because folks have families, who identify as LGBTQ. I think if something is called like the Violence Against Women Act, right? Like that has woman in the name, and so that can feel isolating for certain folks. Or there's an organization, that's called like Women's Safe Space, right? Or, Sisterhood, etc., right? And that comes from a history of, the fact that what was visible were, folks who identify as women as survivors of violence, and so creating those safe spaces. And I think those names were relevant, for the time when folks were not as visible around their sexual orientation or gender identity. Family Justice Center has not been off-putting from my experience in working with survivors of violence, of intimate partner violence, but the names that are off-putting tend to be those that name like a certain gender identity, and so therefore feel like people will feel like, oh, that's the only folks that they work with, when that might not be true. So I don't know if that helps answer the question.
Yep. That is helpful, and that's true of lots of names. I mean, that may be true of something called a domestic violence center or something called a women's center. Or
And
always something about many names that may be exclusive or seem exclusive. So I think that is pretty important.
Yeah, and even like, not Family Justice Center, but like GLAAD, which used to be the Gay Lesbian, I forgot what the other A is for, but Against Defamation organization. Now they're just GLAAD, and they don't use it as an acronym because they acknowledge that they were only using G and L. They were not using B or the T for trans folks, and so that also seemed exclusionary. So there's a shift that definitely happens, in naming certain things that are now being more out in terms of gender identity or sexual orientation, so naming different identities.
Yeah. There's a number of other things. I know we're running out of time here, but just real quickly, there's a number of questions around how to assess relationship dynamics in relationships where both partners may be using violence. And I don't know if you want to make some comments about, but a number of people asked about that. You didn't really have the time to get much into assessing relationship dynamics and aggressor dynamics in relationships where both partners may be using violence in some way, whether it's in a self-defense way or it's in an aggressor way. Or do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I would say in terms of assessing who the abusive partner is in a relationship, one of the things that we do here is we have an intimate partner violence assessment tool that does not use gender identities or anything like that, and asks information of the client, so like, have you ever been afraid of your partner? And then also ask the client, has your partner ever been afraid of you? So we kind of like to ask folks, their perspective on their own perspective and also their partner's perspective to kind of see if folks are minimizing or decreasing choices for their partner and things like that. What we also do in terms of assessing violence is collecting the history. So for example, the survivor may be physically violent against the abusive partner. And they come in and we get a snapshot of the incident, and they say, I was physically violent against my abusive partner, or I was physically violent against my partner, so I am the abuser. And when we've done assessment with folks in collecting their history, there have been certain moments where it's in response to violence that that person is experiencing. So if somebody is, if the abusive partner uses transphobic slurs against the survivor, and the survivor does something in turn, you know, to the abusive partner, figuring out if it's violence, so it came from nowhere, or if it's self-defense is an important distinction as well.
No, that's good. We have a number of questions about working with HIV positive survivors.
Mm-hmm.
It's more just kind of general recommendations on language, on supportive approaches. And I know this is, I mean, over my years as a prosecutor, I had a number of situations where I was dealing with, I can think of one case in particular who was a heterosexual survivor of intimate partner violence who had found out she was HIV positive from her abusive partner after he assaulted her. And as she was saying, you know, I'm leaving, he basically said, well, you can leave if you want, but you're dead because you're HIV, because I'm HIV. I've given it to you now, so kind of screw you. And it was a very, that scene in particular happened in front of my house where I heard a woman screaming, and I came outside, and there she was.
Wow, yeah.
And had to separate them and then try to start to deal with them. So I'm quite sensitive to those questions about, you know, how to reach out to them, how to support them, particularly in the crisis of finding out this kind of health news.
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about capacity comes to mind, because there are folks who do counseling for folks who have become HIV positive recently, or even later on if that person decides to reach out for counseling. So I think thinking about, like, is this the space, like, is the Family Justice Center the space where we have the capacity to support someone on a long-term basis about their, you know, recent diagnosis as being HIV positive. So I think thinking about that is important, because there may be folks who have additional expertise. But I do think addressing the fact that stigma can play into how somebody feels about themselves and how they feel, how available they feel like a relationship in the future will be like, because they would have to come out about their HIV status, is important to talk about. So the stigma and its effects on someone who's experienced intimate partner violence is definitely something to bring into that conversation in order to support folks to kind of destigmatize, demystify, you know, the feelings that they're experiencing, like the shame and the blame that they are experiencing. So that would be my suggestion.
No, that's great. Well, we are coming to the end of our time here, Ursula, but I do want to tell you, we always know that a webinar is good and the presenter is gifted and capable when we have people saying, I don't have a question, I just want to say Ursula's incredible, she did a great job.
Aw, you guys.
Appreciate the information. We've gotten a variety of those comments, and that, of course, is altogether true. So when people say, you know, anytime she's speaking anywhere else, I'm coming. That's a great endorsement. I don't have a question. I just want you to know that. So thank you so much, Ursula, for presenting for us. Thank you for the time that you've given us and for your really excellent information. I'm actually just going to go back for a moment here and put up Ursula's email address and contact information for members of her team that you can see there, and you can access them at avp.org, and you can also see the bilingual hotline number. So I just wanted to put that up one more time as we wrap up. So Ursula, thank you so much for
thank you, and yeah, and feel free to reach out to any of us, all of us. If you have any questions or concerns, the warm line is available. We are available to you, and you know, we are glad to support folks in making their space more inclusive, either for themselves or for their clients, or you know, for the community at large. You know, we're always willing to do that and have those hard conversations as well.
Well, thank you very much. We're honored to have you with us and to be part of our webinar faculty in 2014. Just very quickly as we wrap up, you'll see on the screen this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on our website. Natalia, who's our Director of Technical Assistance, will be posting it. You'll be receiving email instructions on how to download it to access it in the future from our resource library at FamilyJusticeCenter.com. I did earlier give a shout out to our Strangulation Training Institute. If you're interested in that, you can go to strangulationtraininginstitute.com or to FamilyJusticeCenter.com. And then information about our conference in April. We have multidisciplinary teams that come in from literally all over the world for that conference. Not necessarily Family Justice Center folks, but folks that are trying to work in multi-agency models, multidisciplinary team models, where they may be co-locating, whether they're just community agencies coming together or government and non-government folks coming together. So that conference we're very excited about, focused on trauma-informed practice. So I want to thank you all for joining us. We had more than 200 folks registered for this webinar today on very short notice, so that really makes a statement not only about Ursula's gifts and abilities and her excellent work, but your interest in this topic. So Ursula, thank you for speaking for us today. Blessings on you in your work. And thank you to all of you for joining us. We hope you all have a blessed holiday season, and on behalf of Gail Strack, our CEO, and Natalia Geary and our whole team at the Family Justice Center Alliance, I want to thank you for being with us today. Blessings on all of you.